I'm Lou Marinoff, currently professor and chair of philosophy at the City College of New York, also founding president of the American Philosophical Practitioners Association, or APPA. Author of Plato Not Prozac and other international bestsellers, helping people to utilize philosophy in everyday life and translate it into many languages. I did a first degree in mathematical physics and ultimately a PhD in philosophy of science at University College London. I'm a former Commonwealth scholar, and I've done postdocs at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I did a lectureship at University of British Columbia before coming to New York, where I've been a philosopher for about 15 years at City College. This is the mantra today. We talk about, chemical imbalance in the brain as though it were occurring to, for everybody. But there are definitely some small percentage of cases in which people really can't control their brain chemistry, and it may be, in fact, disrupting their normal lives. Another kind of depression can be induced by what people do to themselves. Certainly, if people take a lot of amphetamines or, there are other kinds of drugs over consumption of which could lead to side effects such as depression or suicidalness and so forth. Even some of the drugs that are supposed to make people happy, such as Prozac, among other SSRIs, these may also cause depressive side effects. A third case where people may self-report as being unhappy or depressed would come from perhaps unresolved problems in the past. And in fact, dialogue, whether psychotherapeutic dialogue or indeed philosophical dialogue, is often the best remedy for dealing with and dissolving these kinds of problems, rather than drugs which merely all too often treat only the symptom and not the root cause. There's a tremendous amount of unhappiness in this society, which is really an illness of the culture and not an illness of the brain. And so very often people who are unfulfilled or unhappy or hate their jobs, and people, because of this culture and pressures on us, come up with all kinds of ways of being unhappy. And this is certainly very different from depression. These are discontents and unfulfillments in life, which very often can be addressed by philosophical means. Most of us in life, if we lead any kind of a normal life, and even in some cases an abnormal life, have both happy and sad memories of events in the past. There are certain things in our lives that we think about that cheer us up, and other things that may make us sad. Why then would we not want to focus on the good things as opposed to the bad things? That's a habit of thought, which may have nothing to do with genetics or indeed psychology. It's a habit of thought which can be changed by adopting the virtuous habits and eschewing the vicious ones. That's a teaching from Aristotle, and a very important philosophical one. Our habits, both in our word and deed, but also in our thinking, are very influential in affecting our states of mind. But the mind and the brain affect each other. If you're put in a situation which you find very pleasing to your senses, aesthetically and otherwise, then you will probably develop a mental picture of your surroundings which is very positive, and that will enhance your brain chemistry. If, on the other hand, you're placed in an environment in which the signals you're getting are ones that are negative or causing you distress and so forth, then your physiology and your brain chemistry will change accordingly. But this has to do with what you interpret from your surroundings. The mind has a vital role to play, and this is what's been neglected. People are being treated as though they were machines and diagnosed. Every possible complaint has been medicalized. The human being has been mechanized and medicalized by the system, and the true humanity of people is being sorely neglected. And that is what needs to be addressed, I suspect, in a large number of cases that are being diagnosed as this timing. One of the main problems with the DSM is that things may be diagnosed which are not at all illnesses, in which there has been no causal demonstration of the symptoms being observed to any specific brain disorder. And the other problem is that, in fact, it may fail to really diagnose what the true problem is, if there's a problem with the culture. This book is not about the culture. And so it may make a diagnosis of a massive social kind of syndrome like ADHD without ever touching on what I believe are the real causes. And that's a very serious problem. When you talk about the amount of money and the amount of power that the pharmaceutical industries have in acting on DSM diagnoses, effectively producing substances which are going to be administered to millions of people by a system that we have to trust, then we are really on very thin ice. People talk about epidemics. This, depression is a word that's used very unreflectively, very uncritically. It can mean a whole range of things. Some of them serious, and some of them, the word is being used inappropriately. Epidemic is used in this way too. We have all kinds of epidemics in Western civilization. We have epidemics of divorce. We have epidemics of erectile dysfunction. We have epidemics of unhappiness. We have epidemics of ADHD among our youth. If people are going to use the word epidemic, they ought to be aware of the word epidemiology, which means tracing the causes and the communicability of the thing that they think they're identifying. So what is this ADHD? Anyway, how could we end up having, is it something they're putting in the water? We have 15 million kids with attention deficit disorders. Excuse me, we live in a culture in which children from cradle to grave firstly are reared on television and video games, which erode attention span. Television destroys attention span. Kids are hooked up to virtual realities, which are completely eroding their capacities for normal social function. Japan has the same problem too, by the way, because they're on the leading edge of these technologies, although they have a very different set of standards in their country. We see consonance here because of the technologies. So children are being brought up in a technological environment, like we call it a technocracy, government by technology. It's a technocracy in which they're exposed for hours on end. The average in the US is that kids are watching about 5 hours of TV a day. The TV's on, all day and all night in most American households. It's destroying their attention spans. They're not reading and writing and learning in the traditions which fostered the strengths of Western civilization. Instead, they've been deconstructed. Another factor, so their attention spans are diminished instead of increased. By the time they're ready to sit still in school and pay attention, they haven't got the cognitive development to do it. They're actually cognitively impaired and socially impaired. That's one set of factors. Another is, and now I speak as an educator, the education system's been totally deconstructed. The content that's being delivered in school is vacuous. So schools are worried about the self-esteem of children and not about what they're learning. This is another great danger. And then another factor is, and I'm sure boys are more susceptible to ADHD than our girls, manhood has been devalued. Radical feminism has destroyed the virtues of manhood, and men are definitely an endangered species in this civilization. It's another reason why our civilization is weak, because it's become feminized and effete. And one result of this is that boys are being punished for being boys. There isn't enough discipline, and there isn't enough opportunity for them to let loose and channel their abundant energies in constructive pathways. Instead, they're being drugged. This is sad, and it's also catastrophic. The differences between philosophical counseling and psychological counseling and psychiatric counseling and pastoral counseling and financial counseling and every other, there are obviously differences. People are complicated. We're very complicated beings, and we have all kinds of agendas. When we wake up in the morning, there's a lot of stuff usually going on in people's minds and lots of things we need to deal with. The philosophical dimension has been neglected in contemporary civilization for a long time, and some of the other dimensions have tended to be overplayed somewhat, or rather other professions have reached further than they can grasp in terms of trying to deal with the human being, who is this complex entity. So philosophy was traditionally, and now we're going back to the axial age, if you like, 500 BC, the time of Confucius in China and Buddha among the forest sages of India, and Pythagoras, one of the keynote players in the rationalist tradition of ancient Greek civilization. This is 500 BC. Philosophy was viewed as both a practice and also a set of ideas that was very conducive to leading a good life. And this was not religious particularly. We didn't have to have God, or we did not have to have God. That was more, the Greeks had lots of gods. The Chinese and the Indians had even more gods, and the Chinese didn't really have any gods at all. But they all produced these ways of leading life, which were meant to make people as fulfilled as possible so that they could lead contributive lives and that they could feel like they had meaning and purpose in their own lives and attain some kind of serenity. And this was really the job of philosophers. Philosophy was a guide to the art of living. With the advance now, if you want to fast forward 1,000 years, 2,000 years, science and technology have worked wonders for us. But actually, the place of philosophy has been grossly marginalized, partly by philosophers themselves who've kind of beat this hasty retreat in the face of science and made themselves very often quite irrelevant, doing important work which is theoretical only and within the academy only. And they retreated from making themselves useful. Applied ethics has come back. And the easiest way to understand philosophical counseling may be to look at its forerunner in the last 30 years, applied ethics. take an example, the question of abortion, or the question of euthanasia, the question of stem cell research. We have all these powerful biotechnologies, and we can do increasingly significant things to the human being. Bioethics and bioethicists are debating at the level of social policy. You know, should we use this technology? How should we, or should we not, and why not? And these kinds of philosophers make important contributions to public debate about these issues. And eventually, philosophical positions will inform state regulation and or legislation, and even perhaps Supreme Court decisions in this country. What are we going to do when a person, a real human being, has to make a choice? Should I have, in the case of a woman, should I have an abortion or not? In the case of any of us, should we be pulling the plug on grandma or not? What kind of euthanasia can we actually justify or tolerate or permit? These are all questions which pertain to persons. So philosophical counselors are actually helping persons make the hard decisions on the ground, because social policy is, in a certain sense, very abstract. But when you have that issue and you have to make this call, then maybe a philosopher can help you to deliberate more effectively about what's right and what's wrong. That's one specific kind of instance where we follow from applied ethics. It's not an accident that Plato wrote dialogues. It's not an accident that the Bhagavad Gita, you know, the great book of Indian philosophy, is a dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna. When the Analects of Confucius were written down, they were very often in the form of dialogue between the master and his disciples, and many of Buddha's sutras too. The dialogue is valuable, and we notice some of the more astute psychiatrists and psychologists are, in fact, complaining vociferously that the current generation of practitioners are basically trained in molecular pathways. They're trained to do these paint-by-number diagnoses and then dispense drugs. And they've dispensed with dialogue, which is a very important therapeutic modality. So I just wanted to be on the record about this. Talking to people really makes a big difference. And talking to some people philosophically can make all the difference in their lives. You are, in fact, your own physician in a certain way. The philosopher's job is to help you to realize the resources that you have inside. And between the theory and the practice, there is a big step. Aristotle famously explained in his Ethics, how do we become courageous? We don't become courageous by sitting around theorizing about the meaning of courage. We become courageous by doing courageous things. So it's a question of practice. And I think that philosophy can help a lot just by making people believe, because we can give them evidence and we can give them theory, that this happens and this can be done. But to practice a virtue is really the key. So it's all about lived experience. And if you understand, turning a big ship takes a long time, right? So, you know, you're the captain of your ship in life, and your life is a big ocean-going vessel. The sea of life is very vast, and your vessel is very large. So to turn it takes time. People often make the mistake of being demoralized if they don't see instantaneous effects. If you want to do something significant in life, it's often slow and difficult. That doesn't mean it can't be done or shouldn't be done. It means that you have to have the lived experience. And this takes courage, and it also takes patience. But by practicing these virtues, you become better at exercising them, and then you become better at making the actual changes that count. So a case in point is Vincent. He was a journalist, and he had put up in his cubicle a painting by Gauguin, one of the Tahitian nudes that Gauguin loved to paint. And this somehow, quote-unquote, offended, one of his colleagues. It was obviously a very politically correct company where you are responsible for everybody else's state of mind. Don't get me started on political correctness, okay? And it's invidious erosions of individual liberty, it's absolutely a travesty. Every one of my books I tee off on political correctness because I love being politically incorrect. It's fundamental freedom. We have to be ourselves. Who's responsible for my state of mind? Me. Can you offend me? No, I can take offense at something you say. You could harm me, and that would be wrong. It's certainly wrong to go around harming people physically. It's also wrong to subject children to incessantly to abuses of various kinds verbally. This can inflict emotional damage on them when they're vulnerable and young. But as adults, we're supposed to be able to be responsible for our own states of mind. And so if you choose to be offended, then you'll go around looking for it. And if the system rewards you for being offended, you're going to find offense at every turn. And this is what happened to Vincent. Somebody in his company took umbrage at his taste in art and made a complaint. So he got called in, and the guy and his boss says, look, you got to take the painting down. And Vincent says, well, what if I don't want to? He says, well, you could resign. Well, Vincent was a prudential person, and good journalism jobs don't grow on trees, so he took the painting down, but it upset him. Okay? He was angry, definitely, and very upset. And this went on for a while. He didn't go postal. That's still an expression. You know, he didn't go back to the office with an AK-47 and shoot the place up. He had the good sense, you know, not to take out his frustrations on others, but he was still bothered by it. So he came to me, and we resolved this problem in one session. And we resolved it by using the philosophy of John Stuart Mill. And John Stuart Mill, in his great and heroic defense of individual liberty, says that, in fact, the only warrant that a government or, you know, any authority has to constrain you is to prevent you from doing harm to others. And Vincent's taste in art was not doing any harm to anybody. He was just expressing his individuality. But since we have confused offense with harm, and we've now legislated that confusion, anybody who's merely deciding to take offense can declare that they've been harmed, and then they have a remedy and have power over people. It's terrible. So once I made Vincent understand that John Stuart Mill had addressed this question, and in fact it was a systemic problem, and didn't have to take it personally, then he really felt a lot better. He understood that his problem was fundamentally a question of justice and injustice. It wasn't a mental illness. And in fact, his unhappiness and his anger and his frustration and his depression or dysthemia, if it had gone on for a long enough time, would be in fact all stemming from this case of injustice. It's a philosophical problem. It's not a psychological problem. So we resolved it with John Stuart Mill. And then I gave him a little bit of social judo, a lesson in, I call it social judo. I said, why don't you go back to the office and draw up a short list of alternative paintings, you know, that you wouldn't mind having up in your cubicle, and go around and ask your coworkers to sign off. So, do you approve of this? Okay, I'll put it up. This way, you can satisfy yourself, and you can also have a good laugh in the process, which he did. So we turned his upset state of mind into a serene and even a laughing state of mind, where he could rise above these circumstances. I didn't prescribe drugs. I didn't touch him. I didn't examine him. I didn't diagnose him. I talked with him. The power of ideas is undervalued. Vincent had this problem, certainly. And the problem was something that was caused at work, not something caused in his childhood, and not something caused by some kind of brain disorder. This was a real problem of injustice in the workplace, and he had absolutely no avenue of remedy in the workplace for it. He couldn't undo the enormous amount of damage that political correctness has done to our society. He had not the power. I don't. None of us has the power to undo it, except individually on a case-by-case basis where we struggle against it and triumph over it. But certainly these injustices caused, in the first instance, a lot of anger. And Vincent, being a man, was also brought up probably to kind of suppress his emotions. He wasn't running around weeping or screaming or being hysterical. He was taught to kind of bear it nobly, you know, and to just carry himself. But inside, he was definitely very angry. Buddhists teach that anger is one of the great there are three mental poisons, you know, anger, greed, and envy, and they eat away at us. This really is a poison. If you're angry and nothing's being done to resolve the anger or to dissolve the anger, then definitely the anger can eat away at us and produce all kinds of anxiety, you know, sleeplessness, secondary and tertiary effects, which eventually can become medical. I mean, I've counseled lots of people who've been in the throes of some kind of crisis or on the horns of a dilemma, and if they're not able to resolve the immediate problem, which in fact might be an ethical problem or a professional problem, then they can develop mental or physical symptoms from it. But in the first instance, the problem always needs to be identified and addressed in its root domain. So Sir Vincent was, once we started talking, able to articulate that he was very angry, he was very upset. You know, he didn't like his life at the moment. Every time he went to work, it made him unhappy because he was immersing himself in this environment which did not value him and which he felt in some fundamental way was denying him some basic civil right. And that's a very serious issue for anybody to face. The problem is that he did not have any remedy for it until he discovered philosophy. How to distinguish this from psychology or psychiatry? I tell this story when I talk to psychologists, and they roll up their sleeves, you know, the first part of it describing Vincent. Hey, this guy's angry, we can work on his anger. Psychology is very much, and rightfully, concerned with affect, emotion. So they're going to work on his anger. They could work on his anger for 10 years. They'll never touch the heart of his case, which was a question of justice. Psychoanalysts would have a field day with this guy. Gauguin nudes? Oh yeah, we could sit this guy, we could lie Vincent on the couch for 10 years. and psychoanalyze him and discover why he likes to hang, Gauguin nudes in his office. That's not going to solve his problem. He can get as much psychoanalysis as he can pay for. The problem was injustice. That's philosophical. To understand in a sort of general way what kinds of things happen or can happen in a philosophical counseling session. Generally speaking, we're aware when there's a problem, when something is not right. You have some sense of that. So then you have to determine what kind of problem it is. But it could be anything. It could be what Vincent had at work. It could be a relationship going bad. It could be, a career change. It could be not knowing what to do. It could be having too many choices. It could be the subprime crisis. Whatever it is, if there's a problem, then we have a response. The first response is emotional. We're programmed. This is our hardwiring. So emotions are really, really basic. But we have to learn how to deal with them. Most importantly, learn how to express them appropriately. And the real trick is to transform them. Yes, to take a negative emotion and to transform it into something positive. So you get over the emotion, then you want to start to figure out, okay, what can I do? What should I do, what shouldn't I do? And you can do the analytical work. And a lot of people can do this. And then they get stuck. Because often the analysis just leads to an impasse, or it leads to a more complicated scenario, or maybe you don't see your way through. And maybe your analysis is telling you, there's nothing I can do about this. That could also be the result of analysis. Like you can analyze the global recession till the cows come home. What are you going to do about it? The analysis might tell you there's nothing we can do about it today. It's going to take a few years. So your analysis itself might not necessarily give you a desirable result immediately. So that's why you need more. Take a step back, metaphorically, put the problem into some kind of creative, contemplative light where you can conceive of the problem in a different way. That's where a philosopher can really help. You talk to a philosopher, you're going to get a different perspective anyway, guaranteed. If you get through that, you reach E, which is equilibrium. That's the last step in the peace process. The equilibrium is wonderful because actually then you feel like you felt before the first problem occurred. Difference is, you have a takeaway, you have a tool. If you went through the process, you've got a philosophical tool now that you didn't have before. And that's portable. And it's not a prescription, it doesn't have to be refilled. You can carry this idea with you and use it again next time, or use a variation of it next time. So you've grown. The process has also grown you philosophically. What we're witnessing in a lot of the things we've already discussed have implicitly within them, they're driven by a process that unfolded in the history of science. And physics, became very, very successful, basically from the time of Newton and his contemporaries on to the present. Very powerful explanations of causes and processes in nature. And so it was thought that the progress during the Enlightenment, in particular of physics and chemistry and biology, and the tremendous explanatory power that they have as sciences would continue, that this explanatory power would also propagate through the social sciences. That was the great hope. And it was called positivism. And it was easy to understand how people would have that hope, given the tremendous understanding that the natural sciences have given us of the way the world works. It was thought that we'll achieve the same depth of understanding and predictiveness and awareness of cause and effect in the social world. So they thought, okay, what has worked for physics and chemistry and biology is also going to work for psychology and sociology and economics and political science. It was that hope. But there appears to be a big discontinuity there. And that's why we distinguish between the so-called natural sciences on the one hand and the so-called social sciences on the other. And the ways in which we understand things and the predictive powers of these two branches of science are very, very different. But physics is sort of the atom of, it's the main, it's the foundation of the natural sciences, and psychology is the foundation of the social sciences. Physics is beginning with the elemental properties of things, and psychology begins with the individual, who's like the atom of society. So the idea is, if you understand the individual, then you understand a lot more things. So the individual in this mechanistic model is viewed as a kind of a passive organism, which has absolutely no power of will or power of ideation or power, any control over desires or instincts, just viewed as a kind of a dumb animal who has inflicted on it from early childhood all of these kinds of traumas. And so the goal is to figure out what's wrong with you. When you come to see someone, they've got to figure out what's wrong with you. And in fact, the third-party insurers won't pay them unless they're diagnosed. They have to find something wrong with you. And that's their goal. And it's from Freud, unfortunately, that we get a lot of this mechanistic thinking. Freud had this exact view of the human being. We today call it physics envy, okay? He wanted psychology to become, he wanted psychoanalysis to become as strong as science, as rigorous as science as physics was in the natural domain. It doesn't work like this. So the assumption that Freud made was that there are no mental accidents. In other words, for Freud, every thought is an effect, okay? And its earlier cause was some other thought, which is an effect of some earlier cause. So the idea is if they can run you back, you know, to the point at which you experience some kind of trauma, then they can understand causally how this whole chain of thoughts has proceeded in your mind. And this would be a mirror for your brain chemistry. Freud thought in the end that the brain would explain everything. So he was a reductionist and a materialist, and probably quite wrong about the power of mind, because he disregarded it. He thought the mind was a kind of a phantom that was really just responding, you know, echoing what was going on in the brain, and that we had no control at all over what was going on in our brains because we were just like receiving all these impulses and stuff was happening. So he really discounted the ability of the human being to make a difference in his or her own life. Philosophy begins with the assumption that people have free will. Most of us have free will. Begins with the assumption that, in fact, as Buddha said, as we think, so shall we become. So if you couple those two premises, this is very powerful and empowering, is it not? In the U.S., no one learns philosophy in high school. You have to wait to university. It's often, you know, deferred way too late, if at all. Some of them don't ever get it. But if you do philosophy, then you can hook up with these great thinkers, and the whole thing gets stretched across time. You know, you could be communing with someone who lived a few thousand years ago. In the world of ideas, time has no meaning. So you could actually discover what kind of philosopher you are, and I really believe that. I don't have a name for this, and I don't want to have a name for it, but I really have come to believe that a lot of people are carrying around inside them a kind of philosophical personality, and they're just not in touch with it. So maybe, you know, if you discovered what Plato thought or what Nietzsche thought or what some, you might say, hey, that's a lot like what I think. So people think, well, okay, so I'm really a Platonic kind of person, or I'm a Nietzschean kind of person. And this can be very good. It gives you a way of identifying. You have a place. You can identify with a certain school of philosophy. You say, well, this is what kind of philosopher I am. And I think this is very positive. It gives you a portable perspective on life and a way of explaining a lot of things and making sense of things. That's a really positive aspect of doing this kind of work. It may also end up in the DSM-5 as, you know, philosophical personality disorder. Right? That's a joke.
I smiled. You didn't get that on film, but...
The New England Transcendentalists were really good at this. Anybody who likes to read, I would say read Emerson, read Thoreau and Emerson. They really appreciated nature. They loved nature. They got very close to nature. And they also anticipated, in a way, or reinvented a very old concept from Chinese and Japanese Buddhism that also recommends, or rather says, that we are already one with nature and all our problems come from being separated from it. You know, disunited, as Emerson said. There's something very primal about sitting around a campfire at night. This was the first human existence. We stole fire from the gods, yes? Something like that, according to the Greeks. And so we were able to sit around and keep beasts of prey at bay with a fire, and sit around a fire, oral tradition, telling stories, inventing myths about ourselves. How do we come to be sitting around this fire? So we have a creation story that tells how we came to be sitting around this fire. And then we have an oral tradition that comes from that. And that causes great attention span, by the way. Children sit and listen to stories. They're paying a lot of attention. It's very good for their cognitive development. So there's something very primal about sitting around a fire at night, having to gather your food or hunt your food, and to sleep on the ground, and to maybe pitch a tent, but you're on open ground. And that's really the hallmark of early human survival, being able to survive on open ground, competing with all the other predators, including, you know, marauding others. So that was our initiation into being, and it went on probably for 50 or 100,000 years, and we got so good at it that we eventually built cities, which completely alienated ourselves from the very thing that is the womb of our existence, which is nature. So I would say to anybody who's unhappy to try to connect with nature, and you can do it through ideas. As I say, the New England Transcendentalists, the Buddhists write about this. There's lots of literature. It's not just the environmental activists who will make you angry at what's being done. You have to reconnect to it in a very wholesome way. Right? Trees are beautiful. They're wonderful. Whatever you like, animals, plants, trees, mountains, forests, rivers, it's all good. Connect to it and you'll feel primally at one with things. You won't be depressed.